My name is Andrew Sullivan. I'm 31 years old and I never believed in ghost stories, urban legends, or alternate dimensions. At least, not until last fall, when I boarded a train that shouldn't exist. It was a rainy Thursday night in Chicago. I had just finished a long shift at work and the last thing I wanted was to get stuck in the city's relentless traffic. A friend had mentioned a newly reopened express train line, an old route not yet listed on the official schedules, was supposedly faster if you knew where to look. Said it like a joke, like an urban legend. But that night, tired and desperate to get home, I decided to find it. The entrance wasn't easy to locate. It was down a narrow alley behind Ogilvy Station, hidden by scaffolding and construction debris. No signs, no lights, just a rusted metal staircase leading underground, swallowed by shadows. The deeper I went, the colder it became. But this wasn't the usual damp chill of a subway. It was heavier, like the air itself was warning me to turn back. But I didn't. At the bottom of the stairs was a small platform. The walls were lined with old posters, their images faded and cracked, but the writing wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. The letters twisted unnaturally, like symbols trying to mimic alphabets that didn't belong to this world. That should have been my first warning. Then, the train arrived. It wasn't modern. An old commuter model, metallic and boxy, yet strangely pristine. The headlights flickered, casting long shadows across the platform. The doors opened with a hiss, and without thinking, I stepped in. The interior was spotless. Rows of empty seats stretched down the carriage, their plastic surfaces gleaming under flickering fluorescent lights. There was no one else, no conductor, no passengers. I sat by the window and waited. Minutes passed. My phone had no signal, no Wi-Fi. The doors remained open, the train humming quietly as if contemplating whether to move. Then, with a low mechanical groan, the doors shut, and the train began to move. But it wasn't following the underground tunnels. Through the window, I saw brick buildings sliding past, their forms oddly distorted. Windows were bricked up. Doors stood several feet above the ground, with no steps leading up to them. Street lamps flickered in a rhythm that felt intentional, almost like a warning in Morse code. The deeper we went, the more warped the city became. Streets twisted into impossible angles. Buildings leaned unnaturally, some floating just inches above the ground without any support. And then I realized there were no people, no cars, no life outside those windows. The train picked up speed, and the silence inside became suffocating. I stood up, searching for an emergency brake, but there was none. The doors were sealed shut. My reflection in the window began to blur, as if the glass was no longer reflecting me, but something else, or someone else. That's when I noticed the others. A few rows ahead, barely distinguishable from the seats, sat figures. They hadn't been there before, humanoid in shape, dressed in outdated clothing. Old suits from the 1920s, faded dresses from another era, but their faces were wrong. Blurred, static, like a broken TV screen. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just sat there, heads tilted ever so slightly, watching me. The train slowed down, and the lights inside flickered. When it stopped, the doors opened, releasing a hiss that echoed unnaturally in the emptiness. Outside, there was a station, but not one I knew. The signs were illegible, the walls cracked and leaking a thick tar-like substance. The air smelled of rust and decay. The figures stood up in unison and exited onto the platform. I remained frozen in my seat. One of them turned to look at me. Though its face was a blur, I felt its gaze pierce through me. It raised a hand, gesturing for me to follow. Every part of my being screamed to stay seated, to wait for the doors to close and for this nightmare to end. But I stood up. Whether it was curiosity, fear, or something else pulling me, I don't know. I stepped off the train. The platform was cold. The air felt dense, like breathing through water. The figures walked ahead, vanishing into a dense, rolling fog. Followed my footsteps unnaturally loud against the cracked tiles. The station bled into narrow alleys lined with buildings that seemed to breathe, their walls pulsing gently as if alive. The sky above was void of stars, pitch black, yet the ground emitted a faint glow that illuminated the distorted streets. That's when I knew I wasn't in Chicago anymore. I wasn't anywhere. I'd heard stories of people slipping into places they weren't supposed to find. In Brazil, they call it seti, But here, it's known as the 7 Zone, a place layered over our reality, hidden in plain sight. A city that doesn't belong to this world, and once you enter, leaving isn't guaranteed. I wandered through looping alleys, every turn leading me back to a cracked fountain in the center of a square. Shadows moved just out of sight, whispering in a language that felt ancient, primordial. The figures from the train were gone, but their presence lingered, a constant pressure against my thoughts. Time dissolved. Minutes felt like hours, or maybe it was the other way around. My phone was useless. No signal, the clock frozen. My heart pounded not just from fear, but from the oppressive weight of being utterly alone in a place that didn't want me. And through the fog I saw it, faint glow at the end of an alleyway. The train. The same carriage, doors open, waiting. I ran. The moment I stepped inside, the doors slammed shut. The carriage was empty again, but the lights inside were dimmer, flickering sporadically. The train began to move, and outside, the city warped in reverse. The twisted streets straightened, the hovering buildings grounded themselves, and slowly, the familiar skyline of Chicago returned. I stepped onto the platform at Ogilvy Station, and everything felt altered. The air was colder. Fluorescent lights above flickered in irregular patterns. People passed by, but none of them met my gaze. They walked with purpose, yet their faces were devoid of expression, as if they were moving on autopilot. Outside, the city looked the same, yet off. A sign was missing from a storefront. A building had an extra floor it never had before. Subtle differences that gnawed at the edges of my mind. My phone had signal again, but the time was wrong. It was still the same day, yet I had been gone for far longer than it made sense. I made it back, or at least to a version of home. Weeks passed, but something remains with me. It's in the silence of my apartment, in the faint echoes of train wheels screeching in the dead of night. When I close my eyes, I see those blurred faces staring back at me, their gestures beckoning. And deep down I know, the 7 Zone never truly lets you go. If I ever follow that sound again, I won't come back a second time.